I've been trying to get this guest on for a while, and I'm really excited that he's here. And it's pretty topical considering this past week, rumors of more stolen election stuff coming out of Fulton County. Stay tuned. I'm so excited. This is going to be a great episode. Peach Pundit, the podcast, is a conversation filled with the personal opinions of the people who are participating. Any view or opinion expressed belongs only to the person who expressed it and not with anyone with whom that person is professionally affiliated. Welcome back to another Peach Pundit, the podcast. This is a special edition because I'm excited to introduce my friend Derek Somerville to all of you. Derek, what's your story?
Well, it's a long and sordid one, Scott, but I think what you want is the professional background. So for the purposes of this discussion, that professional background goes back 30 plus years to my first professional career, which was in the military intelligence arena as a U.S. Marine. I worked for the DIA during that period, deployed to a couple different combat environments as a U.S. Marine. Followed that up by serving as a FBI special agent stationed out of St. Louis, working a number of different types of federal crimes, public corruption being one of those, counterterrorism being one of those. Relevant to the discussion today, of course, the intelligence background and the federal investigative background. But in corporate America, I've held a number of executive responsibilities that required the management of very large data sets as large as perhaps, let's say, the Georgia voter file. And so the ability to navigate those, the systems to do it with, and then just the background in terms of analyzing that data kind of lent itself to the 2020 election where a lot of questions were asked. And, there's a lot of nuance in between those three big steps: military, federal law enforcement, and corporate. But those are what bring us here today.
So after the 2020 election, Derek helped run a voter file inspection effort in Georgia, and then he got sued over it, which is one of the reasons why I wanted him to come and talk about not just that case, because it went all the way to a federal trial and a judge ruled against the plaintiffs. Spoiler alert, Derek and his team won. But there are some ground rules that we'll be employing here. We're discussing public events and Derek's firsthand experience. We're not giving legal advice, and we're aiming for facts, methods, and what the court actually decided. We're trying to stay away from wild speculation. I know that's off brand for Peach Pundit. We like to wildly speculate around here, and that's fine. But for this conversation, we're trying to keep it as factually as possible. So when we get back, we're going to talk about why Derek got involved and where he found himself in those last closing moments of the year 2020.
Golden Retriever Rescue of Atlanta, GRRA, is an all-volunteer, tax-deductible charitable organization. They are dedicated to providing veterinary care, comprehensive evaluation, and foster and adoptive homes to golden and Labrador retrievers who are abandoned, mistreated, neglected, or left in shelters throughout Georgia. We encourage you to visit their website grra.com and help connect people and dogs that need each other in their lives. You truly can make this world a better place by helping find homes of gold for these golden-hearted pups.
Americans for Prosperity Georgia champions economic freedom and individual liberty across our state. They advocate for lower taxes, less government spending, and regulatory reform, while mobilizing citizens to engage in the legislative process. Beyond just economic issues, AFP Georgia is committed to more choice in K-12 education for all students and removing government barriers in healthcare, like Certificate of Need. To learn more about the Georgia chapter of Americans for Prosperity, head on over to ga.americansforprosperity.org. Thank you to Americans for Prosperity and all of our Patreons for voluntarily contributing just a few bucks to keep the lights on around here. We really appreciate them. If you too would like to be a Patreon, head on over to patreon.com/peachpundit. Also like, subscribe, do all those things. We really appreciate it. So Derek, you have this investigatory background. You have this expertise. You've done this before, by the way. It wasn't my first time interacting with you. We talked a little about that offline. For those of you who are Patreons in the backstage, if you were in the backstage, you would have heard about that. But what I'm interested in is your motivation. and I know the answer to this, but tell our audience, what made you decide that you needed to dig into the voter file yourself?
Well, it's a great question. It's straightforward in some respects, a little bit complicated in others, but the initial reaction was simply a response to all of the theories that I was hearing. We allude to a prior effort together where I had the same motivation. You learn of something that sounds too fantastic to be real. It piques your curiosity, and then depending on what your experience or resources are, maybe you dig a little bit further yourself. This was a function of looking at the results of the 2020 election, somewhat surprised as a lot of people were, but more interested in grounding my reaction to it in the empirical, the things that we actually could explain and we could prove. And what I was seeing happen, as everybody was, is immediately following the 2020 general election, theories were starting to circulate that to some might have sound, plausible, but to some who might be experienced in matters of again, data, intrusion, penetration of systems, conspiracies. Uh, Looked at a lot of what I was hearing and was thinking, this sounds a little bit unrealistic, and for reasons I know that we're going to dig deeper into. So part of it was a curiosity to say, well, I'm a little curious about what exactly happened. We're going to talk about some detail of just how unique the 2020 election is, but for obvious reasons, it was the most unique election that we've had in Georgia's history, the single largest dependence on absentee ballots ever, and maybe ever again. And that introduced all kinds of issues that were not necessarily being explored when we're starting to hear the reasons that, and frankly, the conspiracies that were coming out to explain the outcome of the election. So one part was that curiosity, which was how do we sort fact from fiction, right? Or as we've agreed on many times in the past, the importance of making a clear discernment of corruption versus incompetence. How do we separate those two things so we can have a clear path down both? Both of those are targets. The other side, though, is I was starting to see our theories being weaponized against the party. In my case, I'm a conservative, and I started to hear a lot of the theories that were being raised by very conspiratorial conservatives being weaponized against the notion of voting again. And in the light of that, we had a special election that was coming for a Senate runoff that was critical to the state. And there were conservative voices that had influence publicly calling for individuals, conservatives, not to vote, to stay home, or your vote was going to be captured and used against you. In fact, this was a theme that spread like kudzu in Georgia. It was everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
I have this growing concern that we have what I would consider undisciplined conspiracies rooted in, effectively fantasy that were now being weaponized against our party, and we're going to result in the loss of a couple Senate seats, which, whether I was prescient or lucky, turned out to be the case. So I was very concerned about voter turnout in the runoff, as well as trying to understand, was there a compromise that rose to the level of criminal activity? Was there a consorted conspiracy? And if so, what was that? And then how do we get people to the polls?
Right. So peeling back just for a second to really refute some of the conspiracy theories that were going on, you gave this fantastic list of things to me that you had heard, and I'd heard them as well. I've forgotten about some of these because they're so incredibly wild. Yeah, there's no other way to really describe them. I'm going to blitz through these. There were claims that a Department of Defense shootout occurred between the CIA and some unknown entity at a Frankfurt warehouse in Germany containing U.S. election machine servers. Special forces had apparently, in one conspiracy theory, special forces had taken possession of Nancy Pelosi's laptop that contained evidence of election conspiracies, that the Italian government was involved and an informant was coming forward to spill all the details. Boxes pulled out from under tables on camera in Fulton County. This is one of my favorites. This is the one where I wanted to ask Rudy Giuliani as a member of committee if he understood the difference between a ballot box and a suitcase. Zero forensic evidence ever provided that the voting machines were compromised. Sidney Powell's promise of the Kraken, although nothing ever came from it. And Mike Lindell's promise of forensic evidence of intrusion, but nothing ever came from that as well. So you had a lot of that. So you're hearing those stories. You're like, I wonder if I can prove that to be true or false. Is part of
Well,
your
some of it was like, this is demonstrably ridiculous,
right,
right?
right.
I mean, and some of it was like, these are running in circles of people that so many of us know, so many of your listeners know. And it was sadly diverting resources, cognitive or otherwise, away from trying to understand what had transpired, because the very next, if you will, battle we had was a Senate runoff, and that's not what we were chasing down. And some of these things you mentioned, and they get even more, ridiculous, because some of these allegations occurred in front of our state Senate, which I think I alluded to in our discussions, that I was able to basically shoot down in real time to members of that Senate committee as these experts were saying them. But when you start thinking about some of these discussions, it was an alleged shootout between the Department of Defense and the CIA in a Frankfurt, Germany warehouse. And we learned about this because a retired Air Force general had sources that told him that, and he shared with the world what he had heard. Well, no one took their time to investigate the general, but he'd been retired from the Air Force for 30 years. Let me tell you who has no sources in the military, a individual general officer or otherwise that's been gone for 30 years. Go to your employer from 30 years ago and try to get information, let alone top secret information. So it was this bizarre cacophony, as I called it, of just noise. And unfortunately, there was a massive appetite for it. And those who decided to try to counter those theories with facts had a seriously uphill battle. Incidentally, which we didn't win, because obviously we'll talk a little bit about the effects on the Senate runoff, but they were tremendous in handing over 2 Senate seats.
Yeah.
That never would have happened had Republicans turned out at just a commensurate level of voting as they did in the general.
Yeah.
So there was just all of this noise. And what I tend to do, Scott, and those that have ever worked with me know this, is I'm going to go straight to the data, indifferent for what it tells me. Let's just go at the data, go at the facts, which is different than evidence. By the way, proof and evidence are 2 different things. Let's go to the facts. Let's tether out the truth, and let's see if the truth aligns with what we think or not. But irrespective, let's just do that first. And so, what you alluded to earlier, which I know we'll go into detail, was simply going into the voter file, which is the enumerated list of every single qualified voter in the state, that has the detail whether or not they voted, where they lived, and all these attributes that are required. And let's see what that data tells us.
So start with the top line there. What was the data that you actually reviewed for our audience? Explain that. And what were you looking for when you started looking at that data?
Right. Well, the data set itself, and there's nuance to the dates of these, is the Georgia enumerated list of qualified voters. And that is a list that at the time had about 7.6 million or so individuals listed on it, active and inactive voters who were registered to vote in a Georgia election. The maintenance of that list is very strictly mandated by federal law. So there's very clear statutory requirements at the federal level that the state must meet. If they don't, the Department of Justice will sue them to make sure that they do maintain it. So this list is the basis for every administration of every election that Georgia has ever had. What made it unique this year, or the 2020, is the dependence on absentee ballot, which we'll get to. But what we effectively did is we took that list of 7.6 million voters just prior to the general election, so we could take a view of what it looked like. And that is the file through which everybody would have passed in order to vote. And then we took a look at it again after the general election. Now, if you think about it, the average citizen does not have the tools to download 7.6 million rows, right? You can't do that on Excel. And it's probably 100 columns of data. So it's a massive data set. But we did have the tools to do this, and we were able to actually take it and break it down into ways that we'll talk about. But that gave us a good sense of attributes like how many people were qualified to vote. Of those people who voted, what was their registered address when they voted? And that would have had to been then the precinct where they casted their vote. So it was those sort of attributes that we looked at and said, okay, one of the theories we had heard was all these people were voting that no longer live in the state. Well, that's something we actually had an ability to investigate with real data. And so those were the kind of answers that we were going after. Some of the other things we could tell in their date of birth. Was there a 140-year-old in the data file that voted? That'd be good to know. Was there a 14-year-old in the data file that voted? The other thing the data file let us look post-election is we could tell whose vote actually got counted. So I could tell how Scott Turner voted. Did you vote early? Did you vote same day in person? Did you vote absentee ballot? And I could tell whether or not you actually cast a vote and when that vote was recognized. So we had a lot of ability to proof check, if you will, some of the theories that were coming out of individuals, not the least of which teams that got brought in by the president, Giuliani and the team that he brought in, where they were making certain allegations from data that they had discovered in our data file, but maybe they didn't understand our data file and made gross misrepresentations of what had happened because they simply didn't understand what a certain code meant. So that data file was really an enormous treasure trove of fact, just empirical fact.
Now, you mentioned the 7-year-old and the 140 or 14-year-old and the 140-year-old. Did you find anybody that met those?
We didn't find anybody. We certainly found voters who were old, but that didn't necessarily mean that they were deceased. And does that happen? It's important to say too, by the way, like this isn't to say that none of these things happened in some largely statistically irrelevant measure, right? I know that there were people that were in the voter file multiple occasions, registered twice, and they could cast 2 votes if they wanted to. Those things existed. There were people that were curiously old. They could have been alive. They could have been deceased. And it's possible that somebody voted their absentee ballot. But at no point out of those 7.6 million records did that ever amount to anything that could actually move the outcome of an election.
There are a couple of different tools that the government uses to, when somebody dies, as an example, there are records that are created, the mortality records. When somebody passes away, the Secretary of State actually has somebody looking at obituaries. They have somebody looking for vital records of death certificates. They're combing that and trying to keep the voter record clean. So there are multiple checks there. But you also were using the National Change of Address database as a cross check as well, right? Walk me through that.
Well, the National Change of Address was actually the centerpiece tool for what we were doing. Because what we were really trying to figure out is, were people voting from out of state? There were, at the time, Democrat actors in other states that were encouraging people to vote from out of state. Some of those people got prosecuted for that, by the way. So it wasn't
we had
like
a case last week at the state election board where somebody was registered. She only voted here in Georgia. She was here in Georgia when she voted, but had registered out of state as well, not realizing that there were 2, but she only voted here. She didn't vote in the other state.
Right.
But that was a case that was heard in the state election board this week.
Right. And we found those. And the significance to the audience is, irrespective of anything, when you register in another state, your voter registration in Georgia is to become inactive immediately. But there are some lags. Some people, and by the way, it doesn't suggest nefarious intent every time. People move out of the state, and the number one priority on their list is their household goods are moving and their kids are going into new schools, and they're having to pay taxes in the new state on the cars they're bringing. All of those things. The last thing on most people's minds are things like updating my driver's license or communicating to my prior state that I have moved. Now, there are tools to find all that. On the deaths, for example, there are Social Security index detail that gets published to the state, and they can reconcile records against that. There are larger clearinghouses, ERIC, and things like that we can talk about. It's not a foolproof system, but it isn't something that moved the needle in any meaningful way. On the underage voters, there's nuance to the law about when somebody can vote, because they simply have to become of age at the time of the election, and they can actually cast their vote prior to, if it's an early vote, as long as they're of age at the time of the election. So there's a lot of room in there in a system that's designed to err on giving citizens the ability to vote, right? it should err on that side, and it will err on that side. But the NCOA was critical for us because it gave us an ability to do a number of things that people might not have recognized. Number one is, the national change of address. Anybody who's moved knows what it is. You go to the Postal Service, now it's online, and you file a permanent change of address with the Postal Service, and you tell them where you are today and where you're moving to tomorrow. That record gets captured in the NCOA file by the U.S. Postal Service, which means that we can then run the Georgia voter file through the National Change of Address database and get a flag back for anyone in that voter file that told the Postal Service, I live somewhere else other than where I'm registered to vote. The left would love to, and they do, malign the idea of the NCOA, but the National Change of Address, which is maintained by the U.S. Postal Service, is remarkably accurate because the only person putting a change of address in for Scott Turner happens to be Scott Turner. So in a very obvious way, you were signaling to a federal agency that I'm no longer in place A. I want you to start sending my mail to place B. Interestingly enough, the NVRA, or one of the federal laws that govern the maintenance of the voter file, the one Safe Harbor Act tool that they have that's permitted and explicitly stated in the federal law is the NCOA. So it is a federally recognized tool for ensuring that the people on your voter file live where they told you they live, and they live where they're registered to vote.
So walk me through
Yep.
your filtering process. You were able to take that data, filter it through the NCOA. You came back with how many records?
580,000 out of 7.6 who had an active record with the U.S. Postal Service for a change of address.
So from there, you filtered it down even further. So what did you exclude and why?
Right. Well, and let's just real quick, Scott, so people understand. When you have a match with the U.S. Postal Service change of address, it isn't just a couple characters, right? It isn't like, the first three letters in your name and part of your address. The matching algorithms are such as they are almost perfect in their ability to identify who it is that they're looking at and whether or not the address and the person match and whether or not they moved. So that's a critical point of information, critical point of data here. It's a very accurate tool. And again, anyone who's ever filed one knows that your mail gets forwarded, first class mail, and that's probably going to become important here. Because this is a very forensic process. The second thing about the National Change of Address is it gives you back information that's called CAS. But basically what that does is it tells you about the delivery point. So it gives you some information. Is the address that we're looking at a residential address, or is it a commercial mail receiving agency? Is it potentially a commercial facility or a church? Is it an address that no longer can be delivered to? So these are all attributes beyond just whether or not the person had filed a change of address that we're able to take a look at the overall quality of the national change or the voter file. Another important point, Scott, here is that historically, Georgia would run that entire voter file through the national change of address, I believe every 3 years, which is problematic because we have about 100,000 people move and change addresses every year. So it gets very messy very quick.
And as people flee California, even more.
Even more. And so by the time that we had looked at it in 2020, it was a brand new administration, right? So it was Brad Raffensperger's administration. And that voter file had not been cleansed since 2 years prior by Brian Kemp's administration when he was the Secretary of State. So that voter file had gone quite some time without being touched or cleansed. So that being said, we expected a lot of results, and I think I gave you some of those. We had 580,000 in that 7.6 million that had filed a change of address with the Postal Service. Here's what the environment would have done at the time. There were actors out there that would have ran with that number. They would have said, see, the sky's falling. 580,000 people in the Georgia voter file moved. But that doesn't tell a story. That's not professional investigation, and it's not what I consider a forensic funnel. We want to start very wide with that forensic sweep, and then we want to narrow it down to the narrowest version of the funnel that we can possibly get to in order to, number one, discern what had happened, and if there's a prosecutorial angle the most narrow point that you can go to in order to be able to prosecute the argument that's revealed and that it has revealed. So this deductive funnel was essential to the process. So we start at 580,000 and we say, well, we don't need anyone that's already been inactivated by the state. And there's federally mandated processes for how that happens. We could talk about those, but it's not easily done, as some on the left and those who sued me would make it sound like we could just remove people. That never happened. It doesn't happen in the state. So we removed, as the funnel narrows, we got rid of all the inactive voters. We removed all of those that had a change of address that didn't actually cast a ballot in the general election, because you can't pass one in the special, right? If I understand, this is old news, but it wasn't of interest to us if they didn't cast a vote in the general election, so we removed them. We removed anyone who was registered with UACAVA as an electric vote caster, right? Because they might be military, they might be part of a DoD group, whatever it happens to be. They're doing foreign service and they're voting electronically. We removed anybody anywhere on or near a military base, anybody. So we just erred on the side of, hey, if you lived on a base, of course, doesn't mean you're military, by the way, but if you lived on a base, we removed you. If you lived near a base, we removed you and your entire household. If there are multiple individuals around a household, we removed it. Somebody could say, well, how could you know the military bases? Well, they're all out there. I lived on many of them growing up. And so whether it was Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska, or Nellis out in California, it didn't matter. We removed them, and we did everything we could to remove them. We removed anyone who lived on or near a college campus. So in Atlanta, for example, we didn't try to determine who in walking distance of a college campus was a student or not. We just removed them. And we went all the way down that line. We removed anybody that had a change of address that was 18 months or older, because maybe it expired and maybe they moved back and we wanted to take that noise out. And then we removed anyone who had actually filed a change of address for a move inside of the same county, because this argument wasn't a concern. If you live in Cherokee County and you move to another address in Cherokee County, you have no obligation within Georgia to do anything other than reach out, but you can vote where you voted before. That's fine. So it was all focused on taking that 580,000, erring on the side of legitimate reasons for someone not being legitimate reasons for somebody telling the Postal Service to send their mail to a place they are not registered to vote. And when we did that, we got that down to, I think I told you, 39,000 or so actual records that we could look at out of that 580,000. So you're talking about, that's less than 1%. And that's Marine math. That's less than 10%. And so very, very, very discriminating process to remove people from that file. What we did not do is make a distinction between Republican or Democrat. We didn't make any distinctions about what counties. We didn't make any distinctions about how they voted, what their genders, what their ages. None of that. That was completely immaterial. And as a consequence, that 39,000 represented a statistically, it was a statistically relevant sample of Republicans and Democrats on both sides. It generally followed the registration patterns of the state.
So let's talk about that 39,000. You've taken the 7.5 million file, you went down to 580. Now we're at 39,000. Those 39,000 are across all 159 counties where you thought there was probable cause to question residency based upon what you've just explained.
Correct.
Plus, there are some unusual address clusters. Explain what those numbers mean and what they don't mean.
Yeah, independent of the address anomalies. And again, so that's 39,000 that said, I no longer live in this county or the state. So it was actually both. But the other data that we got back was very interesting because it spoke to other issues. Some could be explained, but some of them required further investigation at the time. And the Secretary of State's office were quite interested in some of this data. In fact, we'll come back to this, but at some point, the chief investigator there called me and said, found out about me, was reading what was going on online, reached out to me through known networks. I spoke with her. She said, hey, is there any way you can send us your data? To which I said, well, it's actually your data. It's presumed that that this is something you guys already do, and that's probably a little insight into why there were so many problems. But the data came back and revealed, issues with, for example, individuals registered at a UPS store, a mailbox plus, is what's called a CMRA, or a commercial mail receiving agency. While there may be a perfectly legitimate explanation for that, that does not align with the state law, right? State law says that you have to be registered at a residential address. So that was problematic. But in some cases, you would find that, okay, that was a mail receiving agency at the main level of a high rise apartment, and it was outsourced to a commercial provider. And that's why people were getting their mail. So the whole point of the investigation wasn't to say, oh, these people are defrauding, the process. It was to make sure to set up a second level of inquiry to understand, why do we see that? But in some cases, it most certainly was not, those were most certainly improper registrations and should not have been able to cast a ballot, and their ballot should have been drawn into question. We had examples where there was one church in Fulton County that had 2,100 or so people registered to it. The state law permits someone who's homeless to register through a sponsor like a facility or a church. But I found it problematic that there were 2,100 people registered to vote at one church. That's a lot of homeless people in one very small area at one church. And within that cohort of data, there were multiple individuals that were registered multiple times. Again, so this wasn't evidence of 2,100 acts of voter fraud. It was evidence that some maintenance and some inspection was necessary for these. We certainly found, yeah.
So zeroing in that bucket for just a second, the 2,100 there, did you find double voting out of that subset?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
How many cases are we talking there?
Handfuls.
Handfuls being 10?
Yeah, exactly. 10, 8, 7. Enough that, when you get your first one of those, it's like fishing. You get excited. Okay, maybe there's a pattern here. But the fact of the matter is, it wasn't enough to move anything. Wrongdoing.
When you're fishing, you're spending more time throwing your line in the water than you are actually reeling in the fish.
Right. And when you get one, you're like, oh, maybe there's going to be a lot of these. Maybe I found a spot. The fact of the matter is that never set itself up. And believe you me, we looked for it, because when we found it, it's very easy to find, by the way. It's a very easy thing to do if you know how to manage data, to identify people that are registered multiple times. Not hard to do at all.
So
in fact, the state should be doing that.
So what did you find when all the filtering was done? What were the biggest buckets? Was it double voting? Was it people who cast ballots who had filed an NCOA that no longer lived here? What were the bigger buckets of votes?
Yeah. I'd say
and if you can remember, throw a number at it.
Well, I'll try.
Okay.
So very clearly, the address anomalies were the number one issue in terms of voter file maintenance and voter integrity, bar none. That was the number one issue at the 39,000 that we saw, where there was probable cause, in our opinion, to do a next level review as permitted. I'm sure we're going to talk about this, by the Section 230 challenge process, which allows you to question another elector within your own county and whether or not they're a valid elector. So, having that law on the books, and that law requires a probable cause in order for the election, the county election administrators to investigate further. We were looking for probable cause, right? So 39,000, we believed probable cause that there was a high probability that they voted in the wrong county, and therefore the vote that they cast really was ineligible, should not have been counted. That's the largest block. The next block that really caught my eye was... Is there a
number you can throw at that, by the way?
39,000.
That's the full 39,000 of people.
The full 39,000. Now, as we'll talk about, there's been subsequent validation of that over time. And spoiler alert, I'm a lot more confident. As of August of 2023, we were 84% correct, I believe. So for probable cause to take a further step, that's not bad math. And my guess it's actually higher than that by now. But that was the largest bucket, and that's exactly what we were looking for to begin with. The attributes around the commercial mail receiving agencies, there were about 1,300, if my memory serves me correct. There were, dozens of individuals who voted more than once. Very difficult to account for everyone who voted that was registered in another state, but there were handfuls of those. There were dozens of individuals that cast votes from addresses that there's no structure there. So there's no deliverable mail. There's no facility. For whatever reason, the Postal Service said, yeah, there's nothing here. It's an empty lot, for example, or it's a dilapidated building. So there was a lot of that, what I would consider uh, uh, probably representative maintenance artifacts at a level that we would find in any state file anywhere.
So summarize this in a way. The problem that you're documenting: sloppy administration, people who moved and didn't update, something else, and how common is this in other states? Or is it just something that every state deals with it because they have such big voter piles?
Well, I think the one reason that this became such a issue is COVID. So had we not had a 1.1 million increase in absentee ballots versus the general election 4 years earlier, that taxed the system in a way that very few people could have anticipated. Very few people that were administering the election were actually qualified. We should talk a little bit about what to do with that data, given that it was going to be so reliant on the U.S. mails. This address cleanliness became a very serious issue because we had a dramatic increase in absentee ballot use. And I would venture to say that this was an issue in every state in the union, because prior to COVID, there was not another election in U.S. history that was so dependent on accurate postal addresses as this one was. And I know we'll talk about it. This exacerbated the step by the Secretary of State's office to send out the absentee ballot requests to everybody on an unsolicited measure, because when they did that, they sent those through the voter file and had no knowledge of the fact that at least 580,000 of those were going to go somewhere that they didn't intend them to go, and wouldn't know that they were going because there's not a feedback loop for the state. So a couple of things kind of conspired against the election that made it extremely complicated, created a lot of issues that were more attributed to incompetence and a lack of experience than I would say corruption, and ultimately opened the door for this litany of theories that people started to market in, which created real issues, as we're going to talk about, in the runoff.
Right. So you tracked what happened with these records too. By August of 23, what did you see happen? You mentioned the 84%, but break it down. What was happening during that time?
Yeah, and the backdrop of that forensic review of our results was we were getting ready to go into a federal courtroom, and we had to defend the validity of our efforts. And we'll talk more about the court case. So basically what we did is we took those 39,000, the exact same group that we had identified in 2020, and in August of 2023, in preparation for an October court date, we ran them all through the national change of address, and we ran them against the voter file that was active at that point in time. And what we found, and I'm going to look off camera a little bit because I got the exact numbers in front of me. Of the 39,000, we found that roughly 3,100 had been removed by the state. So these are people that had cast a ballot in the general election, but within that short period of time, the state had determined they were no longer an eligible voter, and they removed them. Well, I can assure you they weren't eligible at the time of those votes were cast. Whether or not they had nefarious intent or not, they cast a vote in our election, it counted, and then they were subsequently removed from our voter file because of an address irregularity. Another 9,600 had been turned inactive. So of the 39,000 that we said, hey, Secretary of State, there's a problem with these, the Secretary of State's office ultimately agreed with that and inactivated almost 10,000 of those. Again, these are all individuals with address anomalies, either out of county or out of state, that we said, hey, you need to take a closer look because we're not sure these people should be voting in the runoff. Right? We're not sure they're eligible voters per Georgia law. So that was 9,600 that the state inactivated. Then there was 10,600, so almost 11,000 voters who, after the general and after the runoff, went back to the Secretary of State and updated their address to the address that we said they had moved to. So that we considered the most clear-cut form of self-validation. Like, you couldn't say, well, this wasn't a problem because we said Scott Turner moved to 123 Main Street, but he voted over here. And then after it was all done, he went back to the Secretary of State's office and said, hey, could you update my address in the voter file to read 123 Main Street? So that was massive, 10,600 voters who came back and said, yeah, the addresses that came out of our file that we said they'd moved to, they had in fact moved to. And then there was 9,500 more that had ultimately changed their address again since those elections. In other words, they weren't at the address that they voted from. They weren't now at the one that we said they're at. We had records of them moving again. And so these are people that just move a lot, which that sounds like a lot, but when you have a state that has 10 million people in it, having 9,600 people that move every year is not that remarkable. So you break this all down. This was August of 2023, and I guarantee you the numbers are higher now. Out of those 39,000, you can do the Rambo math, but you have roughly 33,000 or so that probably were not eligible voters. Again, it's really important to say this because people go, yep, there it is. There's the conspiracy. And you go, well, think about it this way. An elderly person moves out of her Cherokee County home to a Fulton County assisted care facility just before the election, files a change of address with the Postal Service to have her mail forwarded, but has not updated her driver's license, has no plan to do so because she's not driving. So there's really no mechanism at this point to update her record with the voter file. She gets one day a absentee ballot request form in the mail that she didn't ask for, but she got one, and so she's going to fill that all out. Well, on that absentee ballot request is a little section that says, where do you want us to send your ballot? She says, oh, send it to Fulton County where I live now, which they do. They're not checking to see if she's registered in Fulton County because she's not. She's still registered in Cherokee County. She gets her ballot, she fills it out and mails it. She votes in Cherokee County, but she's not a Cherokee County resident anymore. That was an ineligible vote. But is that somebody trying to, is that a conspiracy to overthrow an election? Or is that just somebody who got this in the mail, got their ballot, filled their ballot, mailed it, went on with their life?
Yeah.
And I think the overwhelming majority of the people that are in that file, with a few exceptions, and we can talk about, like some, I know exactly what they did, and I know they absolutely broke the law. Absolutely. I've got a really good story on a couple of those. But a lot of these are just people like that. They just moved. They got an absentee ballot request form from Brad Raffensperger that they didn't ask for. They thought, this is nice. They filled it out. They got their absentee ballot sent to them, and they voted it.
Yeah. I feel like in fairness, I want to point out as well that year, I got no fewer than a dozen absentee ballot applications, not just from Brad Raffensperger. One of them was from Brad Raffensperger in Secretary of State's office, but my own party was sending them to me. Other third-party organizations, some of which I've never heard of before or since, were sending them, trying to get people to vote by mail that year. There were dozens of those types of organizations, some of them Democrat, some of them Republican, some of them just interested in the civic duty of voting. But regardless of their motivation, it created a lot of confusion because there were people who believed that those applications were ballots. I had a state lawmaker this week text me saying Raffensperger should not have sent out ballots to everybody. That's not what he did. He sent out an application, and he's gotten a lot of criticism for that. Some of it is earned. Some of it is he was trying to make sure that everybody got one. He didn't want the Democrats who had invested millions of dollars into this effort to be the only one sending them to only Democrats. He wanted to make sure that everybody had at least one. But we all got, I don't know how many you got, but I remember at one point it was literally a dozen.
It's over a dozen. Yeah.
And so it wasn't just Brad Raffensperger, although we mentioned this earlier. So I had heard criticism from current members of the legislature say the problem we had with Raffensperger doing it, one, is we didn't approve it in the legislature. He went out and did it himself. And which an argument can be made, he's within his right to do that as the chief election official of the state. That to me is sort of a weak criticism, but this is a stronger one. He sent it out first class mail, which meant that they automatically forwarded to the people who had filed national change of address requests.
He sent it first class mail through a voter file that had not been cleansed in over 2 years.
Right.
So
yeah.
that's where the inexperience, that's where, you can call it what you want, not having experience in large format mailing, and if they had it, they didn't apply it. They should have known that run that file through the NCOA, which takes a day, and then mail those, and you will know where they're going, because they
And
did not
there's
do that. They
another
went
little tidbit there about whether or not they were allowed to do it or they should have been doing it. There are
yeah,
federal laws around voter
yeah.
cleanup. They have been
Yeah.
sued multiple
Yeah,
times.
and they were allowed to. You're right. There's a 90-day window within a federal election where you are not permitted to make any changes to the voter file.
Right.
Well, no, let's take that back. What you're not allowed to do is to remove anybody whatsoever. I don't believe that you are precluded from maintenance on that file. But this was a decision that didn't happen overnight, and it was going to have significant consequences. Um, and it's one of the statutory policy weaknesses in how we administer these elections, where this voter file should be run through the NCO every month, but it was only required to happen, I think, every other year or every third year for a while. Now, some of that got worked into Senate Bill 202. There's a lot of cleanup that went into that bill, but it really was. If you come back to the perfect storm, it was that act in and of itself the issue? No, the issue was it was passed through a voter file that meant that they would not have any idea where those were going. No idea whatsoever. And they misinterpreted some of the response, because what happened is they do get return mail. And when they get the undelivered mail, and I spoke to the then deputy SOS at the time, and her view was, well, we got the return mail, so we were able to clean it up based on return mail, which you can do. But that didn't provide any insight into the 580,000, and those went everywhere. And there you have your problem.
So when we get back, we're going to talk about how all this work to this point earns you a summons.
On Christmas Eve, no less.
Oh, my.
Peach Pundit has an anonymous Patreon who would like to invite you to learn more about the Alzheimer's Association. The Alzheimer's Association leads the way to end Alzheimer's and all other dementia by accelerating global research, driving risk reduction and early detection, and maximizing quality care and support. No one should fight Alzheimer's alone. With your help, no one will. Learn more on their website, alz.org.
Thank you to all of our Patreons for supporting the podcast. If you too would like to be a Patreon, head on over to patreon.com/peachpundit. Sign up for any one of those tiers. You can join us at the very bottom tier in our Signal chat, Peach Pundit Signal chat, which is lit every single day. You should hear the conversations that are happening right now, not just about this issue, because this has come up several times in that chat, but also the college football scene. Like, I don't know if you guys are paying attention. I am wearing my Kennesaw State Conference USA Championship t-shirt that came in the mail. I was a little disappointed that LeBron James got his swag before me, considering LeBron James has never gone to college. But that's a little bitter pill I can talk about some other time. Thanks again to our Patreons. So Derek, when did you first learn that you're getting sued, by who, and what were they accusing you of?
It was remarkable. So Christmas Eve, we're sitting in our Forsyth County home, and I see a car parked at the end of our driveway. Fortunately, I was on a gated property, so I'm going, okay, but somebody's delivering something on Christmas Eve. About that time, I got a call from another defendant who says, hey, I just got served. They weren't fortunate enough to live on a gated property, so they knew right away. I knew at that point that it was a process server, and it was Christmas Eve. So being a good American, I never opened my gate. I let them sit down there until they just drove off eventually. Called my attorney and said, what do you want me to do? And in a very colorful way, he said, let them sit out there as long as they'll sit out there. Go back and enjoy your family. But it shows you a little bit of the tone of the suit. So we were sued by Stacey Abrams's Fair Fight organization. They were represented by Mark Elias and Perkins Coie. People should know Perkins Coie if they're paying attention. That's the same group that aided with the Steele dossier, and went around the country, basically suing anybody and everybody that did anything that they ideologically disagreed with. The center point of the suit was an initial request for an injunction to make us stop what we were doing. We would later learn they really didn't know what we were doing, how we were doing it, who was doing it, or what the outcome was going to be, but they wanted it to stop regardless. And what they believed and alleged was that we were violating the 1965 Voter Rights Act, and specifically 11B of that act, which is generally reserved for behavior like standing outside of a polling place with a baseball bat and telling people how to vote. So basically, they had filed a federal lawsuit in civil court that said that we were intimidating voters, and they went to the extent to point out that we were intimidating their language, particularly black and brown voters, which was as absurd as it was insulting and demonstrably false. And that was the narrative that they went to the street with. And with that, they raised tens of millions of dollars for Fair Fight, which is all gone now, by the way, and we'll talk about that. But they raised tens of millions of dollars on this theory that these evil individuals were out there trying to actively disenfranchise black and brown voters by filing frivolous complaints and challenges at the county level. And at that point, all they knew about me is I was in a press release with the voter rights group out of Texas by the name of True the Vote. I had never worked with them. I had no affiliation with them. I just met with them. They did a press release and asked if they could include me in it. I said, sure. And that sure put me in a 3-year battle in federal civil court.
So what was their story? What were they actually accusing you of doing? How did they thread the needle of an 11B Voting Rights Act,
right,
voter intimidation claim? What were they justifying? How could they have justified making that claim against you? What were they trying to say?
It was remarkable, Scott. I'm used to the criminal process, not the civil process. And what I'd since learned was that they had sued us citing Jane and John Does, who they didn't want to name because the Jane and John Does that were the victims feared for their safety. And so the initial suit didn't actually name an individual victim of anything. It just had, Jane and John Does. We felt from the beginning like, I don't think there's any real people behind all this. And so when we went before the judge the first go round, and this was Steve Jones, federal judge up in Gainesville, an Obama appointed judge, which, that didn't give us a great deal of hope when we saw that. He actually ruled against their injunction, and we were able to continue what we were doing. And we thought, well, that's the end of this. So they made the 11B allegation. They wanted the injunction, and they made the 11B allegation based upon the testimony of anonymous people that never surfaced and they never named. Over time, we learned that they went out and they recruited these individuals to fill those slots. And we got them to testify.
So they filed the suit using Jane Doe, John Doe, and then they went and found people to play the role of Jane and John Doe afterwards?
Yes. Afterwards. And each of those victims testified to the same in court. So we were able to demonstrate many years later. And by the way, everybody hears the outcome, but they don't realize you have 3 years of fighting. You have multiple rounds of depositions and discovery where you're turning over everything you have, all your personal information. It's absolutely insane what they did, the amount of time that they took, and the amount of money that it cost. $750,000 or more to defend ourselves. So this wasn't like okay, well, we're going to go tit for tat, we're going to be done. No, this drug out well over 3 years, as you know from the timeline. And over that period, we realized that they didn't actually have real victims. So they went out and they recruited them. And we can talk about some of those when we get to it. But each and every one of them absolutely fell apart in court. Their story of victimhood didn't rise to any level that met the federal standard, and that's why ultimately the judge ruled in our favor. And I don't believe, that was what anybody thought was going to happen at the time. But Perkins Coie came out of the gate with nobody. And then for your listeners that aren't familiar with the process, it is unethical behavior for a law firm to go out and proactively recruit a plaintiff. That's grounds for questioning the bar, or for a bar complaint. So each and every one of them had absolutely no connection to us whatsoever.
So
Period.
take us into that trial week. What were the key moments? You mentioned a second ago. Let's get into those. What
Yeah.
did the judge focus on, and what ultimately happened in the January 24 ruling?
Well, our argument at the end of the day was that we, in finding this data, which is publicly available, anybody can purchase the voter file, and then leveraging a state law which allowed us to petition the government, in this case, the individual county election boards, with individuals that we believe that had probable cause. Like, that was First Amendment protected speech. We have a right to petition the government with our grievance, and this is our grievance. So we made a First Amendment claim. The plaintiffs made the argument that, well, First Amendment free speech. So eventually their claims that we were deliberately intimidating, they had to back off. And in the process, the judge made a ruling that we did not need to intend to intimidate in order to intimidate and to be found liable for intimidating. So that was a bit of a blow at first, because okay, so everybody could agree that we were not trying to intimidate anybody, but we still could be found liable in a federal civil court for intimidating. And mind you, it wasn't just Fair Fight against us. The DOJ joined the lawsuit. So now we're facing down Fair Fight and the Department of Justice under Biden. So this was just a spectacular fight that we went into, the details of which we won't have the time for, but it's a heck of a fight. And at the centerpiece of our argument, remember, you have myself and a colleague, and then you had True the Vote. Our argument, the plaintiff's argument, was that, well, you don't have protection against reckless free speech. You can't yell fire in a theater, right? And so they were saying that our effort, because it was done en masse, 39,000 people, that was an argument against free speech, that you're being reckless and you can be held liable for that free speech if you're reckless with it. And that is defended by court precedent. So we had to go back and defend our actions as not being reckless or frivolous or without merit. The good news is, as you know, because we've known each other for a long time, I'm OCD on a level when it comes to forensic and data that most people can't possibly relate to.
I've seen that in action.
And that's why I've always taken everything I've ever done and handed it to everybody and said, pick it apart. And no one has ever successfully done that. So we were very disciplined on my side as a defendant, separate from True the Vote, on exactly why we did everything we did. And over the course of my cross-examination by a very aggressive legal team of like 8 or 9 lawyers, it was the most aggressive legal team I've ever witnessed. And they were so fast and loose with the truth. It was ridiculous what they would say and do to try to shake me up on the stand. I kept thinking, by the way, throughout that whole time, that did nobody with Fair Fight do their homework? Did anybody go and look at my background, know that I'm a trained interrogator? Because everything they did was basic and silly, and it just had no effect on me at all. But over time, the judge started to warm up to the idea that I wasn't some sort of evil individual targeting black and brown individuals. In fact, I had fought in Africa, in Somalia. I was an FBI agent defending civil liberties for black and brown people in St. Louis. And as that came out, you could see the judge's disposition, with specific respect to me, started to change meaningfully. It's like, this doesn't sound like an 11B violation. It doesn't sound like the intent was there. But it got even better, because it didn't even matter that the intent wasn't there, as each of the now sourced victims went up and testified. Each and every single one of them, under cross-examination, were unable to name a single defendant in the trial. So they have sued.
Jane Doe, John Doe, recently recruited, been told, you've been intimidated by these people. And then they under cross-examination, they asked John Doe, please point in the courtroom to the person who intimidated you. Something like that?
They said and it was amazing because by the fourth, you think that they would have rehearsed and had at least the fourth victim, I say, the fourth plaintiff available. These are individuals that signed on to a federal lawsuit that named individuals like me that claimed voter intimidation, who had never met me, had never heard of me, had never seen anything I had done. And when we got into the courtroom, each and every one of them was asked, can you name a single defendant in this case? Of which there's 5 or 6 of us. Can you name a single defendant? Can you even say a name? Every one of them said, I can't. Can you name a first name or a last name? Can you do that? No. I was sitting right there in front of them. Can you point to a defendant in the courtroom? And they couldn't do it. It was at that moment, that was the most emotional moment for me in the trial. I've not, for the first 2 years after it, I couldn't tell that story without getting emotional because I realized me as a person, my history as an American, my family, all of that mattered so little to the people that were suing me, claiming I did these horrific things and they wanted to permanently destroy my credibility. But they didn't even take the time to learn my name. It was a remarkable turning point in that trial, which wasn't going well for Fair Fight to begin with. But it was at this point that our very, very smart attorney, a local fella that stepped in and did an amazing job. He was absolutely
You can give him a shout out.
Yeah, but let me come back to that here in a minute. So, then he started asking, questions about, well, that's Mr. Somerville. He's a defendant. Have you ever received a call from Mr. Somerville? No. Did he show up at your door? No. Did you get an email from him? No. Did you ever receive any piece of correspondence or contact ever from Mr. Somerville? No. Well, then how could he have intimidated you? All but one of the witnesses broke down and cried on the stand. Because of what they realized. At least all of them realized that they had been played, that they had been lied to, that they were a pawn. And the guy to give the shout out to is Jake Evans, who did a masterful job of getting people to that level. Now, I had done a lot of investigative work on all their backgrounds, so we were able to lay their history open in a way that they were not anticipating and the plaintiff's attorneys weren't anticipating. And we had some true Matlock moments, some of which were spectacular. But by and large, most realized that they were pawns in a conspiracy advanced about the election, and that conspiracy was not true, that these people were not evil, that we were not targeting anybody, and everything that brought them into the courtroom that day was a lie. At that moment, Scott, I started to think about how similar both sides of this argument during the election were behaving. There were people on both sides that had taken information that made them feel good, confirmation bias. They had weaponized it. They had gotten themselves all up in a fervor. They had pointed it at people that might not have been guilty of anything. And they went fighting each other. And the reality is that there were people in that courtroom that day on both sides of that case, not me, but there were people on both sides that made money and raised money based on these fights and were making a living on this fight. And there were people like myself and the colleague that was with me that were stuck in the middle of this whole thing. And the folks that were trying to raise that money, that were raising tens of millions of dollars because of this fight, couldn't have cared about the outcome. The plaintiffs, I don't think they ever cared whether they won that case or not because they raised $40 million around it. And some of my co-defendants, it was very clear to me that they were okay to lose because if it appealed high enough, that would take the fundraising up. And I was in the middle of it going, yeah, that dog's not going to hunt with me. We're going to win this case here. This is how we're going to do it. I grabbed a hold of an awful lot of the strategy in the courtroom. Thank goodness for Jake Evans. And we went and we eviscerated their case and we won it. Subsequently, Fair Fight filed an appeal to appeal that decision, but they kicked me out of the case. They're like, we don't want any more of the Somerville guy.
Somerville's got his stuff together too much. What did the judge actually rule when you guys won? What did the judge say?
Yeah. Ultimately, what he ruled was that our actions did not arise to a reckless level, number one, and therefore any argument against our use of our First Amendment right to petition the government uh, simply didn't withstand. Uh, we didn't withstand, and therefore we were fine on a First Amendment argument. He also ruled that the idea that there was an inherent, they made an argument that the inherent application of the challenges in mass, that was inherently antagonistic and therefore intimidating. But if you took the 39,000 out of the 7.6 million, that actually is less than 1%. And so the counter argument was like, these numbers look big, but they're coming out of a massive data file. So there's no way to do a study and not come up with 39,000 names, for example, out of 7.6 million. Under that microscope, which we did a pretty good job of making the judge understand that funnel, it really wasn't a en masse effort. It wasn't sloppy. It was very pointed and it was very precise. Now, I had co-defendants that embarked on a similar process, but they were not as precise. He was not as happy with them, and you can read it in his ruling. He was very complimentary to the work that we had done. I think he was happy to rule the way he did, but he did not like some of my co-defendants, and he had good reason for that. And I don't think he liked the argument that was coming out of Fair Fight.
So if you could rewind back to December of 2020, what would you have done the same? What would you have done differently? And what do you wish the public understood about the voter file?
Well, had I not had a meeting with True the Vote and let them put me in a press release, I would not have been sued. So, I might go back and talk to past Derek and say, yeah, don't let them put you in the press release, because that created 3 years of hell. Just as a side for your listeners, I'm a combat veteran. I was kicking doors on bad guys in St. Louis, one of the most deadly cities in America. I've never experienced the level of dread that I felt going into that courtroom. And by the way, you realize at that moment that your liberty has now been taken from you, because I can't refuse to go in there. I can't just get up and walk out and say I don't want to do it. You have to be there, or a federal marshal is going to bring you there. So that was a very dreadful process that allowed the left to peer into all of my inner workings, get all these transactions, all this communication. And I could have avoided all of that by not not permitting True the Vote to include me in their press release. As for everything else, I want to do a single thing differently in terms of the work that we did. I stand by that work today. If anyone would to go back and recreate it, they'll come up with the same information. As you know about me from previous efforts that we were partnered on, I independently performed that analysis 3 or 4 times from scratch to make sure I kept coming up with the same numbers. And in hindsight, I'm glad I got sued, in that it gave us a great forum to defend our rights, particularly around First Amendment, and to basically set a federal precedent that the Georgia laws for challenging voters, and the idea that large data sets are going to require tools that let you look at data in mass, that's not inherently antagonistic. That went into federal precedent going forward, and that will benefit people for decades and longer to come. So, in hindsight, I think at the time I was the right guy to be looking at this. I was the right guy to get sued, and I had the right skill set to be victorious in that courtroom. Of course, I had great help from Jake Evans, again, who did a masterful job. But if I was to go back and have the conversations, which I did with the voters, it'd be great if I could go back as being from the future and say, hey, you better go vote, because we're going to lose this election coming up because you think that your vote's going to be turned on you. And I can tell you unequivocally, we never found one iota of evidence that a vote was changed. We never found one example of someone who said they voted that we couldn't see that they voted. We basically were able to impugn almost everything that Rudy Giuliani and his team said before the state Senate committee. And there's really not much of the data that we went through that at any point anyone has ever gone back and questioned at all. In fact, as we just talked about 30 minutes ago, it's been validated by the voters themselves that wound up on our challenge list.
Mm. So, bringing it all home, from your work, do you believe the 2020 election was stolen, one, or B, that the wrong winner was declared?
Well, that's the big question. At no point in the last 5 years have I seen a single shred of proof that there was a coordinated effort, conspiracy to defraud the voters. There's no evidence that that election was stolen in Georgia. I can't speak to the other states. There's no proof anywhere, and listeners need to understand evidence and proof are two different things. You can have evidence of a crime that doesn't necessarily prove it. Proof. There's been no proof whatsoever. So, and there's people that think there's been proof, right? The 315,000, ballots that were not, properly labeled, but those are ballots that were cast by actual voters. And so, no, I don't think that the election was stolen. I do think that we as conservatives got remarkably outplayed, and it cost us the Senate. It was a remarkable lack of strategy. But no, I don't think that Georgia certified the wrong outcome, and I don't think that it was stolen. And I know that'll be unpopular with some people that actually have been supporters of mine, but I've never seen proof of that in 5 years.
It, it, it it's unfortunate though, because we continue to see so many in the Republican Party wrapped around this as the thing that we need to continue to relitigate. And we see it in, we saw it this past week in our state election board meeting where somebody brought forth some allegations that have become viral. And we're dealing with that at Peach Pundit through a series of articles, including from Jason Shepard, the former, who was Cobb County Republican Party chair at the time. He wrote a piece on Peach Pundit today. I have one in the works that I've meticulously going through the election process, so it's taking me a little bit longer to kind of pick apart some of the things that were said and provide clarity. But we also see Republicans in Georgia starting to lose in areas where they shouldn't lose. And it's, to me, part of all of this continuing to be in the ether is a major distraction from the things that voters care about. There is a major disconnect between Republican activists and Republican voters. And I've been able to demonstrate that time and time again. If you go to any soccer game on a Saturday morning and you ask them, what's the five most important issues to you today? And this will be the soccer coach who has a 5 of 5 voting record. They're going to say gas prices, food prices, inflation. I want to make sure that my job is healthy. My business continues to do business. These are the things that Americans are crying out about right now. Affordability is a winning message for the Dems. It shouldn't be, because they help drive up the costs of everything through government intervention in the marketplace. And I can go on a whole other rant about all of that stuff. We should not be ceding or conceding this message of affordability to the Democrats, because they don't make anything more affordable ever. But we are taking our eye off the ball by continuing to have this conversation. I'm really glad that we have a chance to sit down. I'm really grateful for you to tell us the whole story, and for that bit too, because we have to move on. And it's not like we haven't addressed some of these concerns. For example, you talked about SB 202. As a closing thought, did you think that the efforts in SB 202 and some of the other things that have happened, we've had other legislation passed since SB 202. Max Burns has done some things around trying to make sure people are registering at an actual address as opposed to a church, as an example. He's had legislation around that. What are you seeing out of the legislature that has addressed your concerns? And what are some things they need to be doing still in order to fully make sure that each seam is tight?
Yeah, I know we're wrapping up. I want to come back to something you said, and I'll answer that question.
Yep.
You talk about us being off message as conservatives and distracted by a tree that's going to bear very little fruit. In fact, it's going to bear no fruit, right? That, I think we can say by now, there's not going to be anything that's going to change the outcome of what happened, and there's really not a whole lot to look at going forward. But after the general election, we made a mistake. And we didn't look at the fact that there was 1.1 million more absentee ballots cast and that Democrats were 68% of that. That Democrats had a 763% increase in their use of absentee ballots versus 2016, and we had a 339%. They were killing us in absentee ballots. And any just basic
While
analysis,
our president, by the way, was telling us not to vote by mail.
not to vote by mail, and so was Sidney Powell, and so was Lynn Wood, and so was all these other people. And yet the Democrats seized that, and when we went into the Senate runoff, we wound up having a 10% drop in our turnout when the Dems had a 4% drop in their turnout, and there was like a 280,000 vote swing in the favor of Democrats because they used the absentee ballot. The absentee ballot was a valid, easy way for us to get voter engagement, and we squandered that. And we're still discussing topics that eroded the credibility and the validity of that process, which lets us get to more voters, lets us get those voters to cast ballots. Some of this is pure logistics, and we failed miserably on the logistics of the election. So fast forward into Senate Bill 202, a lot of great things happened there that we didn't talk about. Not only did they codify the idea that mass challenges were permissible under law, that was great. That challenge, who better to empower to hold one another accountable in elections than the actual citizens themselves? What a wonderful piece of legislation that is. One of my favorites was one of the analysis that we did that we didn't talk about is we looked at all of the mobile voting buses that were brought in by Zuckerberg's foundation, and we geolocated those against polling locations and found that they overwhelmingly were used and placed close to Democrat poll locations, and that they were not put in traditional Republican precincts. And therefore, that was a tool that was disproportionately benefiting one class of voters and deliberately omitting others. So there's a lot of that stuff that is in Senate Bill 202 that got cleaned up. I was fortunate to work with a number of the individuals that contributed to that. And I think there's a lot within Senate Bill 202, which the left, tried like hell to destroy, that have done a lot to clean up. I would wrap that all up by saying that our ability to successfully prosecute these political battles that we're in, that's all going to occur through careful analysis, objective review of what we're looking at, somewhat cold at times, and by looking forward. There's not a lot behind us that's going to help going forward, and we have to shift our attention off of it. It's remarkable to me. Listen, if somebody comes to me and says, "Hey, let's talk about David Ralston," that's where I'm at with the 2020 election. I did my work. I'm moving on. There's other things in front of us, and I hope that's where voices like yours and others can say, "Hey, it's time. It's time to move on."
It is and it isn't, in a way. I'm glad to hear you say what you've said today, but the issue of election integrity is never going to go away, and it shouldn't. We need to, and I think especially specific members of the House on the Republican side have adopted this mentality of continual improvement, which in business, you know what that means. We have to continuously look for the new threats. We have to continuously look for the new weak spot that we didn't anticipate the year before or years before. There are going to be people who want to try to steal elections. And
Of course,
we have a process in place right now that is preventing that. Doesn't mean that the process we have today is always going to be sufficient. We're going to have to continuously look at ways to make sure that we are doing the right things by the voters and making sure that every legal and legitimate vote counts, and that people who shouldn't be voting don't. It's really that simple. But thank you for your time today. Is there anything left we missed out on that you wanted to add before we go?
no, I would just echo what you said. My statement is about letting go what's already been proven or disproven, and recognizing that all of that is getting in the way of doing exactly what you're talking about. These are living, breathing files, these voter files. There's a lot of movement in and out of them every day. Incidentally, there's an awful lot from the commercial industry that can be gleaned to keeping these files squared away, right? The telecom, utility companies, they have large files like this. They keep them clean. There will always be threats. I can tell you that threat always evolves with your ability to counter it. But you can't be diligent and on point in the present if you're still mired in the past. The lessons that we've learned have already largely been woven into what we know in the administration now. There's still gaps in it, but I couldn't agree more. I think it's absolutely essential that we have minimally enough confidence in people who hear this. Cast your vote. And if you think that the system's compromised, cast your vote anyways,
Right.
but cast your vote. And that's ultimately what happened is we had so many people just say, well, I'd rather hand it to them than have them take it from me. Well, either way, you're going to get the same outcome. So why not risk the chance that it wasn't fundamentally broken?
Amen. 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 Peach Fund, the podcast, is brought to us by the generosity of our Patreons. These are the people who voluntarily reach into their pocket every single month and throw us a few bucks. If you want to be part of that, every tier gets some sort of benefit, but the signal chat is definitely worth the $5 a month alone. Considering who's in there and what they're saying is absolutely hilarious on a daily basis. It actually lifts me up. I'm really appreciative for that group of people and the sense of community that we're building here at Peach Pundit. But these are the people who rock, and they are Tony West and her friends at Americans for Prosperity. We have 3 anonymous Patreons, one of whom wants you to know more about the Alzheimer's Association. Amy Davis, Bethany Ballard, Bo Brennan, Colin Martin, Daniel Shaver, Emmanuel Hernandez, Gabe Hartwig. Welcome to the family, Gabe. Jeff Cobble, Greer Howard, Hank Burnham, Harrison Edwards, Jacqueline Harn, James Hall, John Vestal, Jordan Reed, JT Marshburn, Ken Pullen, Kenyatta Mitchell, Lawton Sack, Mike Buchert, Reed Powell, Ron Daniels, Ryan Graham, Ryan Purvis, Sam Thomas, Sergio Ortega, Shannon Wilkinson, and Stuart Wilkinson. Thank you, each and every one of you. We'll catch you next time. If you thought this was a good episode, you want to see more like this, drop a comment. Just as a reminder, we're about to give away a piece of merch to our random comment winner of the month. So sign up just by leaving a comment wherever you listen or watch. And we'll catch you next time. Thank you for listening to Peach Pundit. This is where Buzz would say, go Jackets, but I'm going to say hooty hoo. See ya.